Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatorian. Now this is fundamentally a pretty simple topic and it's about me wanting to know the size of your weapon and talk about the size of my weapons. And it's more than that, it's about the fact that I've looked at this topic of size of weapons and weapon carrying, which of course spans all of history from prehistoric, when weapons were invented, from prehistoric times to now. But I've kind of seen it through a new perspective, a new angle. And the reason for that is that I'm not going to go into the exact details of why, but I'm soon going to be engaging in an activity where I have to, let's call it bushcraft, okay, where I have to carry a knife for completely legitimate legal reasons, okay, not around in the streets of London, but you know, out in the woods. And I started thinking, you know, I'm a massive fan of Bowie knives. I've just grabbed one of my favourite Sheffield made Bowies here, and you will notice this has a relatively large blade on it, at least. Maybe not large if you're used to watching things like Forged in Fire or Rambo, but large historically speaking. Now, I'm just going to go off on a slight tangent very briefly there. Most people assume that Bowie knives are massive historically, but for anyone who actually goes and looks at 19th century Bowie knives, and I've spoken about this in a video previously, you will very quickly notice that when you start looking at antique examples, this is at the bigger end of the spectrum. Yes, you do get some super big ones that were made in the US Civil War, basically for almost like souvenir tourist things, and you do get Mexican ones which are more akin to machetes almost, and South American ones. But generally speaking, if we're looking at North America and Europe, or indeed India for hunting purposes, or Africa for hunting purposes, when we look at hunting or outdoorsman knives, generally speaking, this is about as big as most of them get. That is about 10 or 11 inch blade. When we actually look at the majority of them, you'll notice that the majority of Bowie knives, as they're referred to, and were referred to at the time as well. I know some of you like me to say Bowie, okay, I can say Bowie or Bowie, I don't care. Most of them actually have more like 6 or 7 inch blades. And you do find examples which have way down to kind of 3 or 4 inch blades, you know, pocket knives essentially. And so coming back to the original point, so me thinking about going into this kind of outdoorsman bushcraft context, obviously because I love these big old Bowie knives, my immediate thought is, yay, I can carry a Bowie knife around. But then I think, well, I'm going to be doing lots of different things. Let's say I'd be hunting, fishing, canoeing, climbing, hiking, sleeping, camping, eating, skinning things, doing all the sorts of jobs that I want to do. If I can only carry one knife, do I really want to be carrying a knife that big? And there's also a social aspect to it as well. Do I want to be walking around wearing what's essentially a demi-sword? Would it make me look a bit weird? And even if you go to a 19th century context, if you think about hunting, for example, you might look a bit weird if you turned up for a hunting expedition in the 19th century. You've got your rifle, you've got your other stuff, you might even have a handgun for sort of last-ditch self-protection against big game. And if you were wearing, let's say, a sword, you might stand out a bit and people might make fun of you. So that might deter you from doing it. It's not to say it's not a sensible, practical thing. And obviously people did wear swords for hunting in some contexts, and certainly in Germany wearing fairly sizable hunting swords was still popular in the 19th century. But there might be a social kind of embarrassment context to it as well. And this is true of the modern world. If you went out on a bushcraft weekend or you went out hunting, then you might be too embarrassed to wear the massive knife that you want to wear. So what do you actually wear? For a combination of practical and social reasons, well, then you start to think more about things of this sort of size. And this is a completely practical size, much smaller, but still big enough that you can still do most of the things that you can do with a big Bowie knife. And you can also do a lot of the things that you're more likely to do, skinning or eating or these sorts of things, you can actually do more easily with a smaller knife. And for that very reason, when we look at modern bushcraft knives, and just before I go on, I want to throw in, this will relate to swords. I'm going to bring swords into this as well. So if you're thinking, I'm not interested in modern knives, switch to the next video or whatever, dislike. I am going to talk about swords in a minute because it is basically the same topic. There are many practical things and social reasons why you might want to carry a knife of that size. And indeed, going even further, there are many other reasons why a modern person might prefer to carry a knife like this CRKT, where it's a folding, locking knife with a safety mechanism so it can't fold in. It basically almost becomes as good as a fixed blade once it's open. And you've got as much blade as that other knife, or almost as much. So you can do everything with this that you can do with the previous one, but it has the added advantage of it folds up to being smaller. You can put it in your pocket and not necessarily have to wear it on your hip, which for social reasons might be much more advantageous. Even for practical reasons, it might be advantageous, especially with modern clothing where you might have combat trousers or something with lots of pockets anyway. And you might have other things on your belt. You might have a cartridge belt or something else where you don't want a knife interfering with that. So actually a pocket knife which has a blade of almost the same size might be a better choice. Now I would say you could go, well, why not go for an even smaller pocket knife? Just rummage around in my pocket and get the one that I've got in here. And I think it's another CRKT. I like CRKT. A smaller pocket knife. Well, you start to get to a point where they do get too small for certain tasks. So that might be okay for little tasks, you know, cutting string, not really skinning. It's not really big enough for skinning. But for basic crafts, that might be big enough. But it's not really going to cut the mustard out in the woods, you know, camping, fishing, shooting, hunting, whatever, for a weekend or a week. So there is you need a certain amount of size and a certain amount of strength in a knife, but you don't necessarily need a massive Crocodile Dundee Bowie knife. And in fact, as I've mentioned, there may be reasons why you don't want to carry a massive Crocodile Dundee Bowie knife, either because it's just uncomfortable and gets in the way, or it's heavy, or simply because you're worried that your friends might make fun of you because it looks ridiculous in that social situation. Now, swords. How does this relate to swords? Well, funnily enough, many of these things also relate to the historical periods that I usually talk about on this channel. And looking at the what knife do I carry into the woods question in the modern world has made me realise, well, actually, a person looking to think, well, what sword do I wear for travelling? So if we look at the Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer, we see that all of the people who go on the road to go on pilgrimage to Canterbury, all of the males at least, as far as I recall, all of them have swords, and most of them carry sword and buckler. Now, in that case, it's an arming sword. It's a one-handed sword, almost certainly in the 14th century, with a buckler. So they are carrying bucklers. So, you know, you could say, why don't you just take a sword and ditch the buckler? Because bucklers can be a bit of a nuisance to carry. They can be a little bit noisy. They might fall off, all this kind of thing. But presumably, in medieval England in the 14th century, they thought that there was enough of a chance that they might encounter robbers on the road, or get into disagreements with people, I don't know, that they wanted to carry their full set of sidearms. Now note, they don't carry weapons of war as they were often viewed, at least in English medieval law. They don't carry spears, halberds. One of them has a longbow, I think, or maybe a couple of them have longbows, but bear in mind that longbows can have multiple uses, although there were laws against hunting in the woods, so don't necessarily think about hunting, because certainly in medieval England the laws around bow hunting were quite strict and generally speaking favoured the nobility and at the detriment of the not nobility, of the commoners. But they, generally speaking, they're not, you know, they don't armour up, they don't prepare for war. It's not like a Dungeons and Dragons adventure where they arm themselves to the teeth and carry weapons everywhere. They just carry a sword and buckler, okay? Now, I think that there's an assumption of a social expectation in that. So it was socially acceptable in medieval England in the 14th century to wear a sword and buckler, and perhaps even normal. We know that sword and buckler fencing was very popular in England and obviously other bits of Europe, particularly so in France and Italy. And Spain as well, actually. And so they were socially comfortable enough to wear a sword and buckler, but they were not socially comfortable enough to carry a halberd or a spear or something like that. And indeed, why would they? Why would they need a weapon of that size and inconvenience? And you know, I think that social expectations and norms play a part in this as well. If you travel around with weapons of war, it looks like you're going to start a revolt. And bear in mind that the 14th century saw its fair share of revolts all over Europe, but the Peasants' Revolt of the 1380s was huge in England. Absolutely, you know, commoners walking around with weapons of war could get in a lot of trouble. But sword and buckler, oh, that's fine. Sword and buckler is just for personal defence. So in the modern world, it would be a bit like, I suppose, in certain parts of the world, walking around with a pistol or a knife, but not walking around with a rifle, okay, or an M60, like a machine gun or something, you know. So you know, there was kind of an assumed level of this is for self-protection, this is for war, right? So how does that govern what sword you walk around with? Well, quite simply, if you walked around with a massive spadone or Zweihander or montante, whatever you want to call a big two-handed sword, or a two-handed axe or a spear or something like that, you might be kind of like, people might be like, what are you doing? But also it's highly inconvenient. They're horrible to carry. You can't wear these sorts of weapons. They are not sidearms like most one-handed swords are. But there are legal and social implications to it as well. So how does that affect the sort of swords that we do normally see in war? Well, rapiers, for example. So in the period of this type of, you know, two-handed sword, we also get side swords and rapiers. Now, both of those terms are kind of subjective and fluid, but let's just group them together. Side swords and rapiers. So we're talking about one-handed swords with some degree of hand protection for the hand. They are relatively light and quick swords that are perhaps a little bit more thrust-centric than cut-centric, or at least they are cut and thrust swords. Let's compromise there. So it was totally socially acceptable to walk around with those, and they weren't necessarily seen as weapons of war because it's not a particularly good war weapon. If you're going to war, you want something like a pike or a halberd or a bill or a Zweihander or a gun or a bow or crossbow. So they are sidearms, definitely, but they're sidearms that have been made up to be as effective as sidearms pretty much as they possibly can be. And I've often argued on this channel that the rapier really, I think, is probably the epitome of the self-protection sword. But obviously in other cultures and in other parts of the world, other swords occupied that same spot, that same slot. But in medieval Europe, one of the prime candidates, if you were the right kind of person, would have been a longsword. Now, a longsword, if you think about it, is just about the most bellicose and warlike thing that you can get away with wearing for two reasons. Number one, practicality. If you make the longsword too big and you make it into a Zweihander, you can't wear it. And if you can't wear it, you'd have to carry it. Well, you're not going to walk around carrying a sword. It looks weird, it's inconvenient, it's a nuisance, and it might look like you're kind of on the warpath and looking to start a rebellion. If you wear something, it looks more peaceful. So the longsword is about, and this is Dynasty Forge's bastard sword, incidentally, and before anyone comments underneath, bastard sword and longsword are synonymous. They mean basically the same thing. And this is about the longest, and note that longsword total length is about the same as rapier total length. It is about the longest that you can make a sword and wear it conveniently and comfortably. There is even some debate about that in period, because we know that rapier lengths were legally restricted to certain lengths in some countries, in England for example by Queen Elizabeth, because some people were wearing rapiers that were too long and everyone was tripping over them. But generally speaking, this is about the maximum size that you can make a weapon, and notice that it's about as big as the Japanese tashi gets, or the two-handed dao in China, or basically anywhere in the world. This is about the maximum total length. Obviously you might have a shorter handle and a longer blade, but this is about the maximum total length that you can make a sword and conveniently wear. But coming back to my bushcraft, camping, hunting scenario, do you want to walk around with a longsword? Well, quite simply, I started thinking about this and I thought, well, I don't want to walk around or go around hiking and hunting and camping wearing a massive Bowie knife. Would I want to walk around and do all the things that I want to do in everyday life? Get on and off horses, travel places, go into shops, buy things, carry things, meet people, go to the pub. Would I want to do those things wearing a longsword? Probably not, no. So if I was alive in the 15th century, what would I probably wear? Bearing in mind that anyone who attacks me is likely to have a sword. So I don't necessarily, if I can legally wear a sword, I probably would want to wear a sword, because I don't want to have a weapon which is substantially worse than someone who attacks me. So I want to have a weapon that is a sword, but it's something I can carry more easily. It's lighter, it's a bit shorter, it's more convenient, and it's one of these, isn't it? And I really think this is why this is sometimes seen as the low class sword, and the longsword is seen as the high class sword. But remember, don't be under any illusions here, fencing treatises were made for the most affluent people, okay? And fencing treatises in Germany contain lots and lots of Messer and Dusac. And we know that the Medici family in Italy wore the storta, wore the falchion, which is the Italian equivalent of this. We know that Emperor Maximilian II wore Messers. Okay, so we know that Henry VIII had a Messer. And yes, admittedly, some of those were longsword messers rather than shorter one-handed messers, but they also had one-handed ones as well, and the Medici one is quite short. It's about the same as this. So it's not always a status thing with the size of the sword. It's not always that the nobleman wears a longsword or a rapier. Well, no, actually, lots of noblemen chose to wear these. Or if we go to Venice, for example, the Cinquedea. Oh, how big's the Cinquedea? About the same as this, or smaller, okay? So there are many, many reasons why in a world filled with edged weapons, where you want to wear an edged weapon, both as a sign of the fact that you're not a wuss and you're going to stand up for yourself, and you're a man, and you would defend your honor if someone insulted you, honest, and all of these sort of things, all of these social obligations and expectations around wearing of weapons. But in an everyday world, in an everyday life, would you want to walk around all the time wearing the biggest possible sword you can get away with wearing? I wouldn't. And if I went riding and travelling and camping and hiking and hunting, would I want to walk around wearing a longsword? Would I want to walk around wearing a rapier? No. I'd be wearing one of these, and I don't think there's any coincidence that these were extremely popular all over Europe. And they have parallels in other cultures, in other parts of the world as well, in terms of size and kind of function. And if we look at hunting swords of the 17th and 18th centuries, they are modelled on the Messer. Okay, so there we go. A relatively simple topic, probably vastly overcomplicated by me, but I think it's useful sometimes to come at historical topics through a fresh pair of eyes, sometimes informed by your own modern world experiences. I am going out to do a job. I need to carry an edged tool with me because I need it. What am I going to carry, and why am I going to carry it? I don't want something too small. I don't want something too big. I want something that's easy to wear. It needs to be able to do X, Y, and Z. And when we look at historical swords, we often, and this is all about context, of course, this is a whole video about context. Often when we look at medieval swords, we need to bear that in mind when we're looking at them, and not directly compare two completely different types of swords, because they were often worn in different situations by different people for really different purposes and different motivations. And the same person would often own both of these things and wear them at different times for different reasons. Okay, just a final shout out. This longsword is the Bastard Sword from Dynasty Forge, and this is one of the Langmessers that is available from Landsknecht. There we go, Landsknecht Emporium. You know I have problems with that word. Landsknecht Emporium. And I love both of these, incidentally. They're both lovely swords, and I'll put links to both their websites below this video. Thanks for watching. If this video's been even remotely interesting, please give me a like and subscribe if you haven't done, and I'll see you soon for another video. Cheers, folks! Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.